Today I'm going to talk about intimacy, in particular intimacy in worship. And I just want to start with reminding us as we talk about worship that we remember intimate moments with somebody close. I mean, I can remember being mesmerized. It was an intimate moment every time one of my kids was born. I can remember looking at them and being mesmerized. I'll just embarrass my middle son, Luke. I was, mesmerized by his ears. I don't know why. Just the cutest little ears, He still does. You can go up to him and look at his ears later. But they were particularly cute when he was born, and it was just one of those intimate moments, just mesmerized by that. I mean, we remember those intimate moments with somebody else. I can remember the first time holding Christy's hand or our first kiss, and won't go past that. There's just something about those vulnerable, intimate moments that just kind of burn into you, don't they? I mean, you can remember like having a deep talk with somebody close to you, like one of your best friends. It leaves its mark in you. There's a longing in our hearts to reveal ourselves to somebody else, to be totally open-hearted, reveal ourselves, and to be accepted. And, we're not only marked by those moments, we're like motivated. Like the more of those kind of moments you have, the more you're motivated to have more moments like that where you reveal yourself and you're vulnerable. It really is no different in worship. I can remember some of my first moments where I grew up in church, so we sang hymns, and there were certain hymns that I connected with, but a lot of times I was just singing, warm up for the sermon. I didn't really get worship. But I was at Round Lake Christian Camp. I was junior high. I was probably 7th grade or 6th grade maybe, somewhere in there, summer between 6th and 7th grade. And the dean of the camp was also, I eventually went to the church he was youth pastor at. And he would use not just hymns for the worship time, he would pluck songs that Christian rock artists or contemporary Christian artists had recorded that, maybe like one song an album might be a little more worshipful. And I can just remember there was this old group called the Garmo and Key, and they sang this song called Blessed Messiah. And I'll try to remember the tune, but it went something like this. Blessed Messiah, my Redeemer, you are the mighty King of Kings. Blessed Messiah, my Redeemer, my Lord Messiah came down to me. I was just a little 6th or 7th grader. For some reason, in the midst of that song, my hands started going up, and I wasn't from a tradition where your hands went up. I mean, it may have went up once a month or once a year when they had revival or camp meeting, people would get excited about Jesus. But other than that, they just didn't do that a lot. I just remember as a little kid, now, probably to be fair, it was more like kind of hold the TV range of and eventually got to, here's my big fish, and then eventually touchdown. I eventually, worked through the phases of hand raising and worship, but, something happened, and when I did that, like something in my heart changed. They sang another song. It's by an artist called Twyla Paris. And it went something like, you are Lord of creation and Lord of my heart, Lord of the land and the sea. You were Lord of the heavens before there was time, and Lord of all, Lord, you will be. We bow down and we crown you the King. We bow down and we crown you the King. We bow down and we crown you the King. King of all kings you will be. Now, we didn't have hand motions then, there were certain songs you do little motion, but something happened in the room that all these junior hires, several of us just our bodies had to match the words of our mouth. And I just remember getting on our knees and bowing down. It was the first real time where I think I'd ever used my whole body in worship. And something changed in me, surrender, submission. I was just a 6th or 7th grader, I was experiencing intimacy in worship for the first time. Now, you may not like that word intimacy mixed in with worship because our culture tends to use the word intimacy with sexual overtones. I'm not using it that way. I'm using it with the real meaning of the word, which is simply the way I would define it is into me see. That intimacy is just simply into me see. That if you're going to have an intimate friend, a best friend, you're going to be, intimate with your spouse, if you're going to have any kind of intimacy with a parent, it means that you're going to reveal your heart to the other person. They're allowed to see who you really are. And that's how it is with worship. It's into me see. A value of Vineyard worship, both at our church and as a movement, has been intimacy and worship. And it's really been that way since the beginning here. And I have just a short, 3.5, 4-minute video of testimonies from some of the people who were at some of the very first small groups, some of our very first services at the hotel, the Best Western. And I asked them about worship and how it affected them. And some of this idea of intimacy and worship came out. So let's watch that video together real quick. Think of old songs we used to sing, favorite worship songs from the past and why.
One that immediately comes to mind, I was thinking about it earlier when you were talking, is Undignified.
Oh, yes.
Just because it's from scripture, with David dancing, and there's just something early on that I don't think I've fully tapped into that still.
Right.
That I think there's still part of me that holds something back at times, but there's something about, I will dance, I will sing, to be mad for my king. It's good stuff.
Mine's a dance one too. We Will Dance always comes to mind because I want to dance, man. One of these days, I was just talking to my dad. It might be in heaven, it might be here, so watch out. Or I might be a runner. I've thought that before. I'll go all Nazarene and just run the aisles.
There you go. Oh, yeah.
Freedom and dancing and being undignified.
It's funny, and it may be, I don't remember song titles, but the one that we will dance on streets that are gold.
Yeah.
Is that the one you're talking about?
Yeah.
That song changed me. That was the moment, the first time I sang that song and got it. It was the moment of, now I get it. Like, he likes me. He's got good things for me. He likes me.
Undone and Obsession, they were songs that were just very impactful to me. I think a lot of people in our church. I know Sherry with Undone. I was trying to remember what's the name of that song with the word undone in it. Sherry's Undone.
I remember we had a service after 9/11. Remember at LCC we did something, and it was whom I have but you, right? Is that
Whom have I but you?
Whom have I but you? And it was I think of that even on the anniversary times of just remembering that day and the loss and just that impactful moment, and just that whom do we have except for him? And that just encapsulated. Sorry, Alan Jackson, it was not remember when.
Yeah.
It was for me whom I have, but yeah.
You may have picked up on a thread in the songs that they mentioned. They were all songs of intimacy, of revealing, Undignified. It's a song from the life of King David, who'd been a king of Israel and one of the most prolific worship songwriters. He wrote half of the Psalms in the Bible, which is the worship book of the Bible. And it's a song about how he would just dance before the Lord. He was undignified even. He took off his kingly robes and he just wore a tunic that the peasants would wear. Now, peasants just called it the regular clothes, but royalty called it their underwear because that was just seen as only poor people, and that's the only piece of clothing they could afford. But for the king to only wear a tunic and dance, it was seen as undignified, and yet he was just celebrating before God when God's presence was coming to the capital city of Jerusalem. There were some other songs woven in there that are intimate songs. And when we talk about intimacy, that you may think particularly because last week, Ryan taught, Ryan just did a great job teaching last week, how we have worship that's supposed to be fit for a king. That when we came in here this morning, we didn't start worshiping. Worship was already happening in heaven, and we got to participate in worshiping the King of Kings. And Ryan peeled back the veil, read some scriptures where the veil actually got peeled back for humans, and they saw what was happening in heaven, and they were blown away. And it changed how they worshiped. Did you come in today like that? Did you see the King of Kings? Or did you just mouth some words or just stand there? Did you realize you're in the presence of Almighty God and that you were joining in with what angels and all the saints who have gone before us are participating in heaven? That was kind of Ryan's point last week. Now you might think with that kind of vision that and so much reverence that you would keep God at arm's length, but really that's not his goal at all. You can be totally reverent and still be intimate with God. You might also think that when I use the word intimacy, that it just means that it's more feminine or it's more soft, and yet there's room for fierce, loud intimacy and very quiet, soft intimacy. That guy I was telling you about, David, this guy's a man's man. Grew up as a shepherd, killed bear and lion who would try to kill his sheep. As a teenager, faces a giant. Takes 5 stones in a sling, wings the sling around, throws the rock hits the giant in the forehead, giant falls down, takes the giant's sword, cuts off the giant's head. That's a dude, right? I ain't messing around, and ends up becoming king of Israel and a warrior king, and yet he writes most of the worship songs found in the Bible. And he had fierce intimacy. Take a look at this. This is the giant slayer, the warrior king. Look at Psalm 108. I'll put on the slide here. My heart, O God, is steadfast. I'll sing and make music with all my soul. That's a term of intimacy. Everything within me. Awake, harp and lyre. I will awaken the dawn. I'll praise you, Lord, among the nations. I'll sing of you among the peoples. For great is your love higher than the heavens. Your faithfulness reaches to the skies. Be exalted, O God, above the heavens. Let your glory be over all the earth. Then there's a few verses about different enemies that are coming against him. And in verse 12 says, give us aid against the enemy, for human help is worthless. With God we will gain the victory, and he will trample down our enemies. You got that intimacy, that vulnerability, like, man, you're awesome, God. It's fierce. But we're facing some enemies, and we're going to get trounced. Like, people are going to die unless you step up and help us win this battle. It's crying out to God. Psalm 57, I don't have time to read it, but you could look at it yourself. Psalm 57 is when David, right before he becomes king, the king of Israel, Saul is jealous of David, chases him into a cave, and he just pours his heart out. Imagine, like, you are being chased. You are going to be killed if the king gets you. And you've done nothing but treat the king with honor. You've fought his battles. You've went to battle for him, like literally out in battle. Risked your life for him, and he's trying to kill you. And now you are in a cave hiding because the army is outside looking for you in the hills and mountains of Israel. And you cry out in intimate worship. That's what David did in Psalm 57. Take a look at verse 7 there. Let's go to that next slide. And let's just read that together. Would you read this with me? My heart, O God, is steadfast. My heart is steadfast. I will sing and make music. Awake my soul. Awake, harp and lyre. I will awaken the dawn. I will praise you, Lord, among the nations. I will sing of you among the people. For great is your love, reaching to the highest heavens. Your faithfulness reaches to the skies. Be exalted, O God, above the heavens. Let your glory be over all the earth. The first part was him pouring his heart out to God, like he's on my tail. I'm surrounded by enemies. And then he just pours his heart out in worship. Intimate, vulnerable worship. David also had quiet intimacy. You may be familiar with Psalm 23. He wrote that. And you can just imagine him as a shepherd boy and as a teenager as a shepherd. He's looking at other shepherds and how they lead the sheep to quiet waters and to still pastures. And he may observe a shepherd, taking his rod and beating a wolf off that's trying to kill one of the sheep, or a sheep that gets injured, and he bandages that sheep to heal the sheep. And there's just quiet intimacy there of David going, man, the Lord's my shepherd, I shall not want. He leads me by still waters into green pastures. Yea, though I walk through the valley of shadow of death, I won't fear any evil because his rod and his staff are with me. Even when my enemies surrounded me, he prepares a table for me and feeds me. When I get hurt and wounded, he anoints my head with oil. I'm going to finish out my life saying, surely goodness and mercy follows me all the days of my life. It's intimate, it's quiet. So there's room for quiet intimacy. There's room for fierce intimacy. The big deal is are we coming before God and revealing what's happening into here, into me see? Are we revealing that to God and then trying to look into God's heart and see what he wants to reveal to us? So I've shown you a little bit about what intimacy looks like. Sometimes loud, sometimes soft, sometimes fierce, sometimes quiet. But it's always about revealing our hearts to God. So how do we get there? How do we get there? Well, how do we get to the place where we are actually opening our hearts to God? Perhaps this is new to you. Perhaps that you're used to quiet intimacy with a friend and having a deep talk with a friend, or perhaps you're used to fierce intimacy when you reveal your heart when your favorite team wins or when your grandchild hits a home run. I mean, maybe you're used to that kind of expression, but you've never really developed expression with God of revealing what's happening in your heart with him in worship. How could you get there? Well, go ahead and turn to Luke chapter 7. I want to share you with this story about Jesus, make a couple points about some worship that happens with Jesus, and then we'll close. I also want to tell you this. You may be thinking like, well, so what, Joel? This is just a church thing. You're going to tell us about how to worship when we come in here. How does it affect my everyday life? Hang on to the end, and I will tell you exactly how it affects your everyday life. That if we get this right, it will transform your life and transform your everyday life, I believe. Luke chapter 7, Jesus has been ministering in 7 verse 34. There's some religious folks look at Jesus and call him, they say, you're a friend of sinners. And they weren't saying it nicely. They were saying it as a put down. You're a friend of sinners. And it's kind of ironic that the very next story is a religious, and they say, you're a friend of sinners, you eat with sinners, you're a drunkard and a glutton. And so the very next story is he actually goes to dinner with one of the religious people, which I think is kind of one of those wink, sarcastic things in the Bible of, yeah, the religious folks says he's a friend of sinners, and so where's the very next place he goes? Well, he goes and hangs out with religious folks and who are sinners also. And so he has dinner. And so he goes in, he's the guest of honor at the dinner of this guy named Simon, who's a religious guy. And so the way dinners worked back then is you'd have a U-shaped table. Tables were like really low to the ground. I mean, people had invented chairs, so I'm not sure why they didn't have chairs at most dinners back then, but they just had these really low tables. Here's how you would eat. You would lean on your left arm like this. Your legs would be back behind you, and you would do this. Like if you've seen the picture of the Last Supper, that's not how it went down. They were eating like this. And you would just be stacked around the table, everybody lying like that. So Jesus comes in, guest of honor, probably at the head of the U-shaped table. He's leaning like this, eating, and almost immediately when he gets there, a lady bursts in. Now, back then, it's kind of a man's world, and so dinner would have been men only, and the only lady that would have come in would be like a servant. This lady was not a servant. She's not connected to the house from what we can tell. She bursts in. It would have been a big social faux pas, like everybody going, what's this lady doing in here? She comes over to Jesus. Remember, Jesus is like this. I should have built a little table and done that and just preached like that. But they're like that, feet behind him. And so picture Jesus' head up here. He's leaning like this. His feet are here. She comes in, stands over his feet. As she gets close to his feet, she just starts crying. And her tears begin to hit his feet. And she takes her hair, it was all kind of wadded up. She takes it and undoes it and lets it flow down. Huge no-no. Like several commentaries that I was reading by biblical and ancient scholars said, in the ancient world, for a woman to let her hair down would have been like her going topless. This was like major social, what's going on? Make matters worse, she's not just any woman. She's known as the town sinner, which most likely means she was the town prostitute. She cries, lets her hair down, gets down on her knees, begins to take her hair and wipes Jesus' feet, starts kissing his feet, which that had all kinds of overtones in ancient culture, has this jar of it cost her 1 year of wages to buy this jar of perfume, which begs the question, if she's a prostitute, how did she earn the money to buy this? Breaks the jar open, pours it on his feet, and wipes his feet. Now Simon, the host, is like, what is going on? He's thinking this to himself, this guy can't be a prophet. Because if he was a prophet, he'd know that this lady is the town sinner, and he wouldn't let her touch him, because back then if you were like a sinner or known as a sinner, then you were spiritually unclean. And if you touched somebody else that wasn't unclean, they got your like spiritual cooties. And so they'd have to go through this whole ritual just to be able to go to temple and worship. Like they'd have to go through this ritual to cleanse themselves because you were contagious in your sin. And that's how they thought. So he's like, this guy can't be a prophet. And if he is a prophet, then he's not a very good one. Because like no real clean prophet would let this guy, his mind is blown. Look what happens, verse 40. Jesus answered him, guess he is a prophet. Because Simon was thinking all these things, and now Jesus is going to answer him. Always one of those moments, with God, when you're thinking something and he tells you what you're thinking. Jesus answered him, Simon, I have something to tell you. Tell me, teacher. 2 people owed money to a certain money lender. One owed him 500 denarii, which just means 2 years' wages. Another person owed him 50 denarii, which would have been 50 days of wages. Neither of them had the money to pay him back, so he forgave the debts of both of them. Now, which of them loved him more? Simon said, well, I suppose the one who had the bigger debt forgiven. You have judged correctly. You get what he's implying? She's a sinner. She's been forgiven a lot. There's a little implication too that Simon, you owed a debt too. Maybe you didn't realize that you owed a debt to God also. It wasn't just one person who owed a debt, both owed a debt. Both of you are sinners. This lady just realizes she was forgiven of much. Then he turned towards the woman, verse 44, and said to Simon, do you see this woman? I came into your house. You didn't give me water for my feet, which would have been a huge, in their culture, hospitality was huge. If you had a guest of honor, you usually had a servant or you did it yourself. You washed their feet. You then anointed them with oil because they were a little stinky because everybody walked and it was dusty. And so you just made people smell better when they came into the room. And Jesus says, you didn't do any of this for me. You didn't wash my feet. You didn't kiss me. That was a normal greeting. You still see it in cultures today when they kiss on the cheeks, right? You didn't kiss me, he says. You didn't give me any anointing oil. You didn't give me water for my feet, but she wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You didn't kiss me, but this woman from the time I entered hasn't stopped kissing my feet. You didn't put oil on my head. She poured perfume, costly perfume on my feet. Therefore, I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven as her great love has shown. Whoever's forgiven of little loves little. This guy thought the lady's actions were completely inappropriate for the setting. But in reality, her intimate expressions of worship towards Jesus were completely appropriate because she realized she had been forgiven of much. She responded with intimate, extravagant worship of Jesus. She had received extravagant grace. And when she burst into the room and saw Jesus, she had already received that grace. We don't know from where, but she had already been forgiven. She'd already received grace. She comes in the room, she just can't contain herself that Jesus forgave me. And just begins to weep and show these intimate expressions of worship to Jesus because of all that he'd forgiven her of. When you're aware of how much you've been forgiven, then your intimate expressions of worship are completely appropriate. I mean, I just think of how much God's forgiven you. Think of all your sin that you've done in your life. Lies, lust, anger, gossip, pride, theft, stealing, relying on any other object or any other person instead of relying on God first. Just think of all the sin and then just think of all that sin cost God, that Jesus died on a cross for you. And if you really realize how much you've been forgiven of, then really the only appropriate way to respond is extravagant, intimate worship, isn't it? Like think about when somebody gives you a really costly personal gift. Oh, thanks, man, that's great. No, you're intimate, you're vulnerable. You oh man, thank you, that's awesome, thank you. Man, it means so much to me that you'd give that to. It works that way in human relationships, right? Somebody gives you an incredible gift or something very personal or extravagant or intimate, then you respond that way. It demands that way. We express love and joy in human accomplishments and with gifts. We express that with cheers or hugs or shouts or high fives or tears. Well, then why not God? God saved you and given you so much more than any human could. This grace that Jesus gave this woman wasn't just extravagant, completely forgiving all her sins. It's also intimate. Did you notice that Jesus won't have anything to do with the labels the town has put on this woman? They all want to call her town sinner, prostitute, whore, refuge, yuck, trash. Simon, do you see this woman? See what's happening right there in the moment? Jesus just restored her dignity. She's not the sinner, she's a woman. Daughter of God, accepted by the King of Kings. Jesus didn't just forgive her and say your slate's clean. He actually gave her her true identity back. A woman created in the image of God, loved deeply by God. He said, what's all the kisses about and wiping his feet with her hair? It's just so close and intimate. Well, she had been given intimate grace. What's more intimate than getting your identity back? How else would she respond but intimate worship? See, extravagant intimate grace demands extravagant intimate worship. Think of all that Christ has forgiven you of, and think of the cross and what it cost him. Then think of all the grace he's given you, like your life, salvation, your friends, your family, food, community, a roof over your head, etc., 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 all that Christ has given you. It's extravagant, isn't it? And yet all too often when we come to worship the Lord, if we sing at all, it's just like the words just kind of dribble off our chin and just kind of hang there, right? Like, just something wrong with that. You've been forgiven of much. You were hell-bound. You have an enormous debt you owed to God. The wages of sin is death. That's the debt you owe, is death. And yet you've been forgiven by Jesus, and it was costly. The King of Kings, the innocent one, bore your sin on his back with every lash of the whip and with every nail through his hands and every hour on the cross. He absorbed all of your sins. And the best we can do is just let something kind of just hang out there. I don't want to be too showy in worship. Somebody gets a little leather ball through a hoop and I'll stand and cheer and go stupid. But, King of Kings saves my life. We don't want to get too fanatical. Well, my kid does something cool. Oh, yeah, that's awesome. Took your first step. Yeah, that's good. Well, I'll be vulnerable and share my heart then. But the fact that God gave me the kid, the fact that God let me breathe this morning, well, I don't want to get too crazy about this religious stuff. Really? I think it's a smack in the face of God that I would cheer more when my favorite football team scores than here. There's something wrong with our values. Extravagant, intimate grace demands extravagant, intimate worship. Real quick, what do we learn about intimate worship here? Number one, intimate worship requires risk and vulnerability. This woman risked much. She steps in the room with all the good people, all the connected people. They were rich because they could host a dinner. That's the only people that hosted dinners back then. And so she risks her reputation, which was already soiled, but she risks it in a very intimate, close environment. She risks that in order to worship the King of Kings who had saved her, given her a new identity, and forgiven her. If you're going to worship God the way he deserves, you're going to have to risk. Let's just say it in the room. You have to risk whatever you're going to look like to the person who's standing next to you or sitting next to you today. You have to risk that, She risked everything when she burst in and demonstrated her allegiance and love to Jesus. And she did not care what the rest of the people thought about her, Do you take risks in worship? Are you vulnerable in worship? First, starting with, do you open your heart towards God? As we sing these songs, that most of which are in first person spoken to God, do you open your heart or do you just mouth the words? Or are you actually opening your heart, saying, God, into me see, and God, would you open your heart, and through these lyrics of the songs, help me see into your heart? Do you take risks in worship? Are you vulnerable? Do you expose your true feelings? Do you question God? Do you lament grief that you're going through or losses? Do you celebrate? Do you just get real with God in whatever you're going through? Extravagant, intimate grace demands extravagant, intimate worship. Intimate worship will cost you something. It cost this lady her reputation and the possibility of being made fun of and judged. It cost her a very expensive bottle of perfume. If you're going to worship God the way He deserves, and you're going to worship God intimately, then it is going to cost you something. A baseline is going to be, it's going to cost you some time, right? You're going to say, okay, I'm going to give an hour and a half to church. I'm going to give a few moments in the morning when I wake up and I pray to worship God. It's going to cost you some energy. Like, I don't know that when I walk in here at 9 o'clock on a Sunday morning that I'm like, hey, let's go, you know? I mean, if I have a few cups of coffee, it helps, but I mean, still, it's like, okay, here we go. But I'm entering into where the King of Kings is at, and heaven is worshiping, and He's paid a price. He's bought me with His blood. He's broken Himself so my brokenness could be made whole. And so I just have to make a decision of, this is going to cost me some energy to engage. Did it cost you anything yet so far, besides just time? That's just baseline time. It's supposed to cost you heart and energy. It's one reason we take an offering is because it's worship. David said one time in worship, he said, I don't want to worship God with anything that doesn't cost me something. So even when we give an offering, it costs you something to worship. You're giving to God. Your heart, your mind, your body. It costs you something. If it's really worship, then it'll eke out of the 20 or 30 minutes that we sing songs, and it'll eke into your everyday life. It'll cost you generosity towards God. It'll cost you how you treat people tomorrow, after church and outside of church. Any intimate relationship costs you something. Again, I'm not talking about intimacy and sexual overtones, but just any intimacy closeness is going to cost you something. If a husband really expects to be close to his wife, then he'll have to cultivate the relationship. He'll have to serve his wife. He'll have to help her feel safe and cared for. A wife will have to, it'll cost her something to have that with her husband. She'll have to express honor and respect towards her husband in private and public and show interest in the things that he's interested in. That's just how intimacy works. And it's always reverent. I mean, every married couple knows that true intimacy is reverent. They treat it with respect, but it's close. It's not at arm's length. Intimacy costs them something. In a human relationship, how much more relationship with God? Extravagant, intimate worship will cost you something. Finally, the other thing is intimacy is holistic. Intimate worship is full-bodied. It's holistic. It involves your body, your mind, your soul, your emotions. Like my wife, Christy, if I walk into the house after work and go, I love you, Christy, she really doesn't believe it. I don't really believe it when I say it. I'm really into you, Christy. You're beautiful. Thanks for dinner. Thanks for doing my laundry. I know I'm pretty gross. I mean, it doesn't do anything for her. Again, we treat humans way better than we treat God. My guess is you've been way intimate and way more expressive with the humans in your life the last 24 hours than you were with God the last hour. Here's the cool thing about holistic worship. Part of intimacy, and we'll hear this next week on that there's authenticity to be in worship. Part of it is you come in and you share with your heart. So if your week sucked, then tell God it sucked. Be real, be honest, But part of intimacy is you open your heart and you actually say what's going on. You don't just stand there numb. You actually tell Him about it. But here's the cool thing about holistic, full-bodied worship. When my heart is not engaged, my body can train my heart to be engaged. So maybe I'm not walking up the driveway thinking, I really love my wife today. I might be consumed with thoughts of my day. Guess what? If I walk in, I go, man, Christy, I love you. Thanks so much for all you do. Even if I didn't feel it, by saying it that way, it trains my heart to immediately feel it. If I don't feel like surrendering to the Lord and my heart's in a cruddy place, I can train my heart to surrender to the Lord. I just do this. Because it's pretty open and vulnerable at that point, standing before you and him. And all of a sudden my heart feels way more surrendered to Jesus. If I don't feel submissive to God, and my heart's been rebellious, I can train my heart to be submissive to God. I just use my body. I just get on the floor, lay down. And all of a sudden, my heart gets trained to be submissive to God. Get it? Those of you that have been around a while know this trick, but everybody just frown with me for a second. I mean, most of you already are. So go ahead. Just. You feel that inside? Like the spirit of Eeyore is descending on you. Now do this. Just make your biggest smile, man. Man, this is good, isn't it? This is the best sermon you ever heard. Joel's doing great, right? Like everything changes, doesn't it? Do you get that? Your body just trained your heart to feel a certain thing. You can do the same thing in worship. If you're not feeling it, use your body. I'm not talking about being manipulative or making something happen. Certainly don't be inauthentic. But if you're not feeling submissive and you know you're supposed to submit to God, then get on your knees. If you're not surrendered, do this. If you haven't been asking God to receive much or haven't felt like you've received much from him, then in worship, hold out your hands and say, I want to receive from you. And you will begin to feel it and hear that you're receiving. Intimate, extravagant grace demands intimate, extravagant worship. Now here's the so what, real quick. And we're going to wrap up and practice this. But the so what? Take a look at Luke 7, and you say, well, so what, Joel? Okay, God deserves it. That should be enough. I get it. It's the right thing to do, okay. But beyond that, how does that affect my everyday life? Take a look at verse 48. Then Jesus said to the woman, now he says, your sins are forgiven. When did they get forgiven? Sometime before the story, right? Because he said the reason she was acting the way she was acting was because she was already forgiven of a big debt, right? So he's not saying it because it happened right then. He's saying it for her benefit and for who else's benefit? Everybody else. The other guests began to say among themselves, who is this who even forgives sin? Jesus said to the woman, your faith has saved you. Go in peace. What's the so what of it? I don't know. How would your day change tomorrow if you knew Jesus looked you in the eye and said, you're clean, man. All the crud you did, it's gone. And I know the label other people put on you. You're ugly, or you're not good enough, or you're not accepted at school, or you keep screwing up at work, or you're just stupid, or nobody will accept you. You're not only just cleansed of your sins, you're cleansed of your label because I just see you as a beloved child of God. I don't know. Would that have any impact in your everyday life? You're a single mom, you don't know how you're going to make it. What would it do if in the next 5 minutes you encountered Jesus and he looked you in the eye and said, hey, you just need to know you're okay in my book. You're clean. I'm with you. You trust me. That's going to save you because you trust me. And live your life in peace. Go in peace. I give my peace to you. I don't know. Would that change your everyday life? I don't know my mission and purpose. I'm just trying to decide what to do in life, Joel. I don't know which way to go. I don't know what the direction. Well, just tell me this. Would it change your life if in the next 4 minutes you encountered Jesus and he said, you know what? You're my friend. I'm going to be with you forever. And if you'll trust me, that's where you'll find your mission, purpose, identity, and salvation. And I'll give you peace as you discover it. I'll be with you. I don't know, would that change your life? Let me let you in on a secret. You have the opportunity to do that every day. But particularly, you have an opportunity to have that kind of an encounter every Sunday if you want it. If you don't, if you just want to listen to music, you can do that. But you're missing out on coming face to face with Jesus. I know I'm laying it on thick, but it's just truth, and you need to hear it, and I need to hear it. Like we're missing out on an opportunity every time we enter into worship to encounter Jesus and have him look in the eyes and say, I accept you. You're forgiven. Your faith has saved you. Go in peace. How do you put it into practice? Grab a Seek God for the City booklet when you leave. Practice it every morning or lunch or whenever you're going to read the book. Read the prayer. You saw it doesn't take very long. I read the prayer here. But enter into worship and praise God for the things that are written and open your heart towards him. Be intimate with him. I've given you another tool. On every other chair, there's a worship bookmark. And it has just simply some song lyrics, like a line or two from classic songs we've sang over the years. And you may know some of the songs, you may not know them all. I would encourage you to practice, put that in your Seek God for the City booklet, and practice this week intimate worship with God. Now you may not know the melody, so you want to get vulnerable, then be by yourself and make up a melody. Or just say the lyric to God. Or as our fierce warrior King David used to say all the time, sing to the Lord a new song, just make it up as you go. But I've given you that bookmark so you can practice intimate worship. Let's go ahead and stand. Phil's going to lead us in an intimate worship song. We're going to see what happens. But this song talks about Jesus being our friend. And if you don't know the song, many of you would. If you don't know it, then I'd encourage you maybe to listen and try. But here's my challenge to you as we stand and worship. My challenge to you is to try something. Press in. Go to the next level. If you've never engaged your body in worship, then reach out to God. If you need to surrender, if you need to receive, if there's a lot of pride in your heart and you want to break that, get on your knees and submit to God. I want to encourage you. If you've never sang, then try to sing. If you've sang but you've not engaged with the heart of God, then engage as you sing with God. Get intimate with him. Into me see. You say, well, I'm a little nervous with the people standing around me. Let me just let you in on a secret of the woman. Her audience wasn't anybody in the room except one. The audience was Jesus. Your audience isn't the people standing next to you. I don't do anything that distracts them, But your audience was Jesus. So Jesus, reveal yourself to people right now, and I pray that you'd begin to draw people close to your heart and that we would enter into some intimate worship, even extravagant, because you gave us extravagant, intimate grace. You've saved us and delivered us. So, in fact, I would just encourage you, I'll give you like 5 seconds before Phil begins to play. Just make a decision right where you're at that I'm going to open my heart to God and I'm going to let him see into me. And as I sing these words, I'm going to try to look into the heart of God. Into me see. And I want to see into him. Take 5 seconds and make that decision, and as Phil plays, then you worship that way.